The Midnight Sanctuary. This is I guess you could call it like a visual novel. It's almost like a 3D movie kind of thing. And I played it in VR, but the interactivity is pretty limited overall. So it's definitely a game where it's more about consuming the narrative than it is like interacting with this world per se. But I think it uses VR in some interesting ways, so we'll talk a little bit about that. But the core of this game really is a narrative about kind of religion and faith and kind of how that impacts people's lives and things like that. And so it has this like really cool aesthetic that gives it kind of this like mystical, supernatural feel. And there's definitely like supernatural story elements to this game for sure. But it also kind of integrates some real world narrative as well that kind of grounds its story a little bit. So basically it's set in like an 1800s, I believe, Japanese village that was founded by like persecuted Christians. And so the story comes from like a pastor coming in from a different region of Japan, basically, and they're trying to help the village kind of research their history. The village is like in a kind of I guess to say population crisis, and they're trying to become like a tourist attraction for Christians so that can help like their village survive and things like that. So she's essentially investigating the history of the village to kind of build a marketing plan that kind of draws people. So your role is kind of like this guide that basically brings this pastor around town. And so you basically look at a map and you kind of pick and choose different sections of the map to explore. And while you are selecting places to go, and sometimes you have multiple places to choose from, there's no real decision making here. Every location has its own story aspect that you basically have to watch to move on. But what this really does, I think, is it helps create a sense of space of where the player is located at times, because while you're doing this story, pretty much the entire map is visible the whole time. It is a very small village, and I think that's kind of part of the appeal, is that it kind of like puts you in this place and makes it feel like a real place, even if it has this very like, unique aesthetic to it. And from a VR perspective, I think it also tries to kind of put you in the world as well. Some characters will kind of look at you and address you, but you don't really have any strong physical presence. So like, just don't expect to like really interact with anybody. And a lot of times it will kind of feel like people just forgotten you're there as they kind of like go through the story and things like that. So if you play the console version of this game, it has more of like a cinematic presentation with like various camera angles and things like that. So I haven't played that version to say like which one is better or not, but I imagine just like it gives a different feeling of how this world is presented kind of thing. So as you're going around this town, you're basically trying to better understand each person's view of religion a little bit. And what you kind of find is that every person has different feelings about what religion is in the city, and also like the stories that kind of tell the story of like the religious history of the city vary from person to person as well. But they're all kind of bound by this similar faith in either God or the supernatural, or however you want to like categorize it. And so you start kind of like putting together the pieces of like, what is the faith that this village kind of truly believes in? Like, what is the core consistency between all these groups? But during this process, the savior shows up and basically starts rapturing people, and having this like real manifestation of what, religion is and what their faith means kind of brings these theoretical, like story driven things that were like things that happened in the past to the real world. And so these differences between how people see faith and religion start to really flare up. And so the church itself and the people in the village kind of start pulling apart in their own ways. So people who have like faith in the savior start believing that this is a good thing, and then those who question their faith start treating the savior as more like a demon, and that's kind of like tearing the town apart. And as the savior is going around, basically the situation starts to degrade, and you end up teaming up with like a core group of people to basically try to come together and help this town survive this situation. And it's interesting because each of these people have their own kind of unique view of faith and religion. The main pastor is still part of the group, who's kind of part of the wider Christian church in Japan. There's a ninja who's kind of like an atheist. There's kind of like the local government representative, and then also the local church pastor as well, who kind of represents the religious beliefs of the local city. And they're all kind of, in some ways, going against the citizenry in their own way. But it's all very complicated. This game doesn't really feel like it has a very strong core message of like what it really wants you to believe. It feels more like almost like a people watching game in some ways, where you kind of get to see how like, blind faith in the savior kind of buries a sense of personal responsibility and in some ways a will to live. But then it gives them at the same time a really strong sense of happiness, a strong sense of purpose. And even if it like that means that they might live like less fulfilling lives overall. Where on the other side, people who seem to like be more against the savior seem to really value life. And then also like try to make a difference that doesn't necessarily like rely on faith and things like that. And so it kind of leads them to a more fulfilling life individually, but it ultimately kind of like isolates them from their friends and family. And it often results in like a lot of sense of uncertainty and a lot of unhappiness kind of thing. And even between the savior and the church, there's tension of like what it means to save people and things like that. And both sides kind of have their benefits and downsides kind of thing. So it really is a game that I don't think revels very much in conflict. It's more about just kind of showing you these different pieces of conflict. And it's kind of, you're just like observing how it plays out. And it tells it in a very like matter-of-fact kind of way. Like one thing that you'll notice if you're playing this game is that it has a very light-hearted feel at times. I'd say most of the time. But it also is a serious story with consequences, right? Like characters are committing suicide in this story, and you get to see it kind of in front of you. And I think a lot of games will use this contrast as like a selling point. Like when I think of like, Hatoful Boyfriend or like Doki Doki Literature Club, where it's like, look, it's so lighthearted, but look at how bad it is, or how scary it is kind of thing. But this game, I think, keeps these aspects of its storytelling very close together. And it kind of recognizes that these kind of more lighthearted moments and these more like, I guess, devastating moments in these characters' lives are just kind of like a reality of this world and like a part of the core narrative rather than these like totally separated kind of things. And I think that's like part of why the story succeeds in feeling this very like consistent narrative that doesn't really like go out of its way to really elevate any particular part of its story. It just kind of feels like it's kind of putting something in front of you. And sometimes that can feel maybe a little directionless at times, and I think that really makes it hard for this game to kind of build a strong conclusion. But I think that messiness is like part of the narrative appeal, and I think ultimately, I think the writing itself is really well done to help hold this story together. And I think, I don't know anything about, I do not know what good Japanese voice acting is, but there is a pretty solid voice cast here, it seems like. At least that seems to be one of the selling points here. And in some ways, it's kind of interesting to see this like weird VR Dreamcast looking world that you're like seeing in person if you're using a VR headset. I don't think it necessarily uses the VR elements super well here or to the fullest extent that it could be, but I think it does a really good job of using VR to really establish that sense of place. And I think some scenes of the game definitely feel built around the idea that you will be there in person looking at this other person kind of thing. So I don't have a lot of like experience with Japanese Christianity, so maybe this is like kind of bog standard what goes on with these kind of narratives. But I think it's a really cool game. And I think if you play it in VR, you'll definitely get something out of it. Just, don't expect it to be a revolutionary VR experience. I think it is like the most baseline implementation of VR in a lot of ways. So, but I think it's just a really strong narrative experience on its own. So even if you don't have a VR headset, I can't say for certain that it's the exact same experience, but I think the things that I value in this game feel a lot more built around the story rather than necessarily like how you interact with it.